Okay, so many of you were here yesterday, which means that some of this may be redundant and I can't use the same jokes as yesterday, so it'll be much less funny, and Monique told me to keep it shorter. So that doesn't mean that Monique's career isn't impressive and really hard to summarize. So we're very pleased that Monique has visited here Davis after taking a brief hiatus, and hopefully she'll come back permanently. But she is an affiliated faculty at all these places that you see mentioned here. You didn't mention Bristol this time. So she's in high demand. She also didn't mention that she's a member of the National Academy of Sciences. But of course, most importantly, she's Distinguished Research Professor Emeritus from UC Davis. And she worked here for 30 years before presumably retiring in 2019. And so I don't summarize her whole career for her, and she'll do some of that today. I'll just say that even since retiring, so in those just 5 years, she's published over 40 articles, received 4 large collaborative grants, continues her research into several topics, including economic inequality, how we can explain it across different societies, the challenges and possibilities of humans cooperating to solve sustainability challenges, and the topic of her talk today, which is one element of kinship structure and how and why it varies cross-culturally. So this is all to say that whatever it means to be emeritus, I know we have a lot of very productive emeritus faculty here, but it doesn't mean that she's really retired or taking a break. So Monique started her formal education as a social anthropologist from the University of Edinburgh, and then went on to her PhD in Northwestern, where she produced one of the first dissertations applying evolutionary approaches to human behavior, including on the topic that she'll be discussing today. And after a postdoc at Michigan, she joined UC Davis. So we were lucky enough to have her here for over 30 years, just over 30 years. And in her time here, not only was she faculty in anthropology, she also was a member of the ecology and animal behavior graduate groups, the Center for Population Biology, which illustrates the range of her interests and the range of her mentorship. Her projects usually use the most current models in evolutionary biology and ecology to make sense of human behavior, to understand our species and the patterning of its cultural diversity. And many of her projects also include an applied component to address persisting societal challenges, as we saw yesterday for the ones who were luckiest to be here yesterday. So it's not surprising that she's mentored students that have jobs both in academia across the US and beyond, and outside of academia doing kind of applied work to make kind of environmental justice issues and equity issues better for all of us. So it's really inspiring to see how deftly she approaches projects that both speak to our deepest curiosities about human evolution and also are able to have implied importance in the real world. And all the while, she remains clear-eyed about understanding the importance of the local cultural context wherever she might be working. So she's been at the forefront of questioning our often ethnocentric assumptions about what it means for a cultural practice to be harmful. And in this research, she brings an anthropologist's eye to questions that are often left to development agencies and development economists to solve. And I think we'll see a really excellent example of some of this work today. So please welcome Monique Borgerhoff Mulder.
Thanks.
Just a little bit shorter.
Thank you so much, Christina. And first of all, thank you to the STORA committee for inviting me. I've just had an incredible two days catching up with everybody. I'm absolutely exhausted, so I'm going to try and struggle through this talk. But I'm doing something kind of fun. I'm coming back, as Christina said, I'm coming back to a model that I used in my PhD research. But I'm coming back with new data, new collaborators, and perhaps most importantly, new tools. And that's what I'm gonna, the sort of odd thing about it is that some of the data that I'm going to present, particularly at the very beginning, is probably data that I presented in this very series, the Ecology and Evolution seminar series, in 1989 when I interviewed here, where I was, I remember giving the talk in, I think it was Wellman or Hunt or Harthall, one of those places. So this is a weird kind of return to come back to polygyny in Davis. But I'm going to jump the lights are on. I'm going to jump right to the present to start this talk and to present this idea that polygyny has been classed as a harmful cultural practice. The UN Committee for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women has decided, has called that it convenes a woman's right to equality with men, causes serious emotional and financial consequences, has grave ramifications for women's human rights and the economics and well-being of their children, and they call for it to be discouraged and prohibited. And this is based very much on the data, a mix of micro and macro level studies done both by anthropologists and by economists, which show typically low fertility associated with polygyny, high child mortality, poor health and nutrition outcomes, and also maternal mental health problems. And economists have focused more on the sort of household productivity, showing it's lower in polygynous households. They focused on abuse of women, and they've gone on to talk about civil violence and warfare as well as being associated with polygyny. This has been picked up a lot by the popular press, including The Economist, who had an article, Why Polygamy Breeds Civil War. They were so excited by it, they revisited it for a Christmas special, and then came back to why nations that fail women fail. And this is the kind of logic here is you have polygyny, you have lots of unmarried men, you have violence, they're not contributing to households, they're sort of squabbling with each other to get access to women. When they marry, they're not very good fathers because they're kind of competing to get more wives. And this leads to sort of civil disobedience and ultimately to low economic productivity. And so it's seen as a kind of a social bad. I'm going to argue that this kind of caricature of polygyny is based, first of all, on the selective use of data, that it reflects ideological biases of researchers typically based in Western cultures who have an abhorrence of, or at least until recently, had an abhorrence of anything other than monogamy, that there are a lot of methodological problems in the studies that I put up earlier, or the results that I put up earlier, and also that obviously polygyny is a very diverse institution, and there may indeed be polygynous situations which are not satisfactory, but we need to recognize the diversity of polygynous marriage. And I'm going to do this by sort of looking at the history of the application of the polygyny threshold model, which was a model introduced to explain the mating behavior of this beautiful bird, a red-winged blackbird. And I'm going to use this to try to both interrogate and dispel this kind of negative caricature of polygyny. So as I said, I'm going to start with the polygyny. I mean, I haven't defined it, but it's when one male is mated with multiple females, right? Typically at the same time. And so the polygyny threshold model is an ideal free distribution model. And on the y-axis, you have fitness there. On the x-axis, you have territory quality. And then you have these lines, these isoclines, which is basically the fitness of the primary settling female and the fitness of the secondary settling female. And you can think of it like this, that there's two males. Just think of it with two at the moment, a male on a good territory and a male on a poorer territory. First female arrives, obviously she's going to take this position, right, because she's going to get the highest fitness. And the second female who arrives has the choice between the male on territory A and B, but is actually going to choose to settle with this guy in a polygynous relationship rather than this guy because she's going to get higher fitness, right? So the threshold is really the threshold in wealth differences between men or males that causes females to mate, to settle polygynously. And you can imagine that if there's an equal distribution, if territories are continuously distributed across here, females are going to assort themselves according to this ideal free distribution in such a way that their reproductive success or whatever outcome you're interested in here is going to equilibrate. And so we would expect to see their fitness to be independent of their mating status. That's very simple summary of but that is the model. It's an ideal free distribution of females across males mated, living on different territories. The predictions from this model are obviously that male territory equality will correlate positively with the number of mates he has and his reproductive success. The second one, I've kind of already explained, that the reproductive success or fitness outcomes, we're going to talk about various ones, are equal, generally equal between monogamously and polygynously mated females. Though they're both within populations and then between populations, the simple hypothesis is that we'll get more polygyny in populations with greater resource inequality. And basically, this talk is going to go through these hypotheses. There's some assumptions, obviously, of free female choice, that they can settle where they want. Obviously, that female reproductive success is affected, at least in part, by the resources that males are holding. That's kind of what drives this. And that resources are divided equally, or perhaps better to think of this as predictably, between co-mates. And there's, of course, a lot of moving, that's a very simple summary of the model, but there's a lot of moving parts here. You could think first of how populations or species may differ with respect to the importance of male resources or male resource holding power to female fitness. And this was fundamental to Emma Noring's original sort of proposal here. So effectively, the steepness and shape of these curves will vary between species and populations. Secondly, there may be interference and/or cooperation among co-mated females. So effectively, this is kind of how close are these different isoclines, and this might reflect the extent to which male resources are shareable, right? I'm going to talk later on in the talk about rival resources. Can they be equally partitioned or not? And it's also going to depend on the extent to which co-mated females help each other out, cooperate. And a third issue is the distribution of resources here. That hasn't really been looked at in the non-human literature, but in work I'm going to talk about later, it's actually the patterning of that distribution is a pretty important factor in understanding mating systems. And then, of course, there's the measures of fitness. And there was an interesting paper on acorn woodpeckers, which showed that if you compare the fitness or the fledgling success of female acorn woodpeckers, whether they're polygynous or monogamous, polygynous females lose more. They fledge less offspring, I think, because they eat each other, or they kick each other's eggs out. I'm not sure, something going on there. But if you look at lifetime fitness, actually there's no difference between monogamous and polygynous, because the polygynously mated females seem to live longer for reasons I'm not sure they established. So all of these are kind of moving parts that we'll kind of be exploring, but we're going to explore them in the context of humans and the application of the polygyny threshold model. So this is where I go back to what I talked about when I was here 36 years ago. Basically, to start my PhD, I crisscrossed Kenya to find a population where it was kind of appropriate for testing the polygyny threshold model. And I found an ethnic group called the Kipsigis, Kalenjin people living in Western Kenya. Did fieldwork there between 81 and 84. One nice thing is that men have, oops, I went back. Oh, what did I do? Okay. Men have lots of wives. This guy actually, only two of these wives he's the guy, two of these are his wives. This is a daughter-in-law and just some of his kids, but he's got about 30 kids or something. So polygyny is common, with some guys having up to 12 wives. Parents, they do make decisions for daughters. So when girls come out of the puberty seclusion rituals that you see here, but the decisions are heavily influenced by the preferences of the girls. So I'm going to consider it as free female choice, although there are people who would challenge that. And resources are divided equally among co-wives. You can see here a typical polygynous household, 3 wives and then 3 granaries, 3 grain straws in the middle. The grazing land is divided into 3. The cultivation land for maize is divided into 3. So Kipsigis men say if you don't divide things equally between your co-wives, life will be hell. So that's how they do it. So the slide I'm going to, so first of all, I'm going to talk about female, so to sort of characterize the polygyny threshold model, I looked first at a female settlement pattern of basically Kipsigis. They kicked the Maasai out of this valley in the early 1930s, and then Kipsigis men settled in this valley and accumulated wives. And yeah, I was not alive, I'm very old, but wasn't alive in the 1930s. But the nice thing about humans is you can collect retrospective demographic, marital, and economic information. Obviously not as accurately as you would like, but this is at least what I did to examine whether female settlement does follow the pattern of an ideal free distribution. And yeah, we talked about this at dinner last night. You're going to see a figure made with letraset. I don't know how many people in this room know what letraset is, but we actually had to kind of, every data point you had to kind of, it was like a kind of transparency sticker. You had to kind of, get every data point on that. So whether you trust my data or not is, another question. I appreciate that. But this was the result. I call this the St. Pancras figure because it looks like a train station. But what you see here is the breeding opportunity. Well, basically, in 1932, there were 3 guys who'd moved into Arbossi. One had about 40 acres, the other had a little bit less. And when they get a little triangle there, letrasetted on, it meant they got married that year. They attracted a wife. The next year, a hugely ambitious guy came in and carved out 300 acres and, not surprisingly, got chosen. A wife married him. The third year, so that's 1934, I think, this guy now, the breeding opportunity he's offering to an incoming female would only be 150, right? Because he has 300 acres, he's now only got, she would expect to get 150. And she actually didn't get chosen that year, but she got this person here got chosen that year, but the next year, that guy got chosen. Anyhow, you can work your way through there, and you run it through a kind of, we used a marketing model statistical analysis long ago. And yes, we find that basically females settle with males according to an ideal free distribution, i.e. they choose the breeding opportunity with that they got access to most land. And I've done this, these are agro-pastoralist people, so land is important, also livestock are very important. I did the same thing with livestock, but I won't bore you with that. So that was, do wealthy, so let's go to the first prediction. Wealthier men are more polygynous. This figure doesn't show it exactly, but it does show the association between wealth, again measured here in acres, and lifetime reproductive success. You can see most men have well over 10 kids, and that's because they've got multiple wives. And these guys, got like, this guy's got 70, 80 kids or something, and both of these guys have 12 wives. And so this association, in the chapter that I published this, there was shown to be mediated mainly by polygyny. So yes, wealthier men are more polygynous. And this is not really a very surprising result. Lots of people have found this same thing. This was work of my supervisor, Bill Irons, working with pastoralist populations in Turkmenistan, and then work from northern Kenya with the Mukogodo, same pattern. And it's hardly really a surprising result, but I just kind of need to get it up there as the first hypothesis. The second one is the reproductive success or fitness of monogamous and polygynously mated females equal. Here again, welcome to another letraset figure. You can imagine making something like this takes a long time. For the older cohorts of women, the completed family size did not negatively decline with, this is marital status, so this is monogamously married, first wife, second wife, subsequent wife order, and there was no clear pattern that polygynously married women were doing worse. For the younger ones, I had surviving offspring per year, and again, no pattern. And then I did this, so this is marital status, but you can do it for a number of co-wives, you can do it from other ways, so that like number of years your marital status involves co-wife overlaps and things like that. I just couldn't find any effects, any negative effects. And I did this controlling for education and other factors that were shown to be independently associated with reproductive success. But this is really coarse data, right? I'm going to move on from this. But the question is, why are there no costs when so many costs had purportedly been found in the literature? And I mean, this is a nice quote from an ethnographer who worked with the Kipsigis long before I ever got there. who argues that polygyny is as much appreciated by women as by men. When a man wishes to take a second wife, he usually consults his first wife. He certainly does so if he's wise. She then frequently selects a wife from among her own friends, and goes on to talk about the harmony in these households. So there were, of course, cases that were not harmonious, but for the most case, they were. So looking then, sort of stepping back from this, I started looking to reviews of outcomes, both fertility, child survival, reproductive success, child health, mental health, household food security. And really, if you look at the data, it's much more mixed than the UN proclamation kind of summarized, and indeed than the Economist kind of caricatured. And it's at this stage that I'm going to take sort of a sidebar. I'm going to take 3 little sidebars to sort of delve into this relationship more, because it really is critical to whether we're willing to think of polygyny as a harmful cultural practice. So we will come back to H3 later on, but I'm going to take these 3 little sidebars. So the first one is, are co-wives necessarily in conflict? The second is, are we committing ecological fallacies in our comparisons? And the third is, are we defining monogamy and polygyny appropriately? And I've just got a little bit of data on each one. So to assume co-wives are always in conflict, it's kind of odd thing to do, particularly as, I'm an evolutionary anthropologist, and most evolutionary anthropologists are always going on that we're a cooperatively breeding species, it takes a village to raise a child. There's all this emphasis on cooperation over raising kids, and yet co-wives are just seen as poison, that they are never going to cooperate. And this has always kind of jarred with me. I've worked in many different populations across East Africa, and I've seen plenty and plenty cases of co-wives working together over childcare, over food production. These women here, these are Sakuma women, the 2 in front are co-wives, and they're off to court. They're taking their husband to court for bad behavior. So, the wives will gang up on their husbands. They're, there's a lot of support these women can get from their co-wives. And I kind of wish that I had more systematically collected data on this, and I never did. It just didn't sort of seem to me an important issue. So I was very excited to be invited to collaborate with some behavioral economists from UCSF? USF, and Christina and I both got involved in this, and it's an interesting study they did. They conducted, so it's Alessandra Casar, conducted experimental economic games with about 300 couples from the Mendi and Temne peoples of Sierra Leone, who are very polygynous. And Bethany, in particular, she was the one who sort of played most of the games in the field. And what she did was she played 4 different kinds of games. So the share game, the costless share game, the envy game, and the costless envy game. And she played it with different pairings. So a man would be paired with his wife, and he'd be paired with his monogamous wife, and he'd be paired with his polygynous first wife, or his first polygynous wife, or with his monogamous wife, or then with his polygynous wives, who would obviously be second. And then women would be paired either with their husband or with their co-wives. And so each of these pairings could then be classified according to these 5 different sort of relationships. This is following Fair's work on these experimental economic games. And they could be classified into pairings or relationships that are egalitarian. All of these terms are really self-explanatory. Resource maximizing, that means that you play the game in a way that, or the series of games, the distribution of how you play the games is consistent with maximizing the resources for the unit, either a monogamous unit or a polygynous unit. They could be characterized as generous, characterized as selfish or spiteful, or kind of pretty obvious outcomes. And the result is kind of interesting and not expected at all, in that we found that this maximizing, so resource maximizing for the household, was most prominent among polygynous households. So don't look at all of the whole, so there's too much information here, but when a man plays with his wife, his monogamous wife, he plays in a less maximizing way than he plays with his P1 or P2. And similarly, when a monogamously married woman plays with her husband, she plays like this in terms of maximization, but when she plays with if she's polygynous, she plays, again, more in a maximizing way. And this is kind of consistent with other evidence that is coming out using different methods, but also finding that these polygynous units are really pretty efficient, and they're resource maximizing. They're not necessarily entirely egalitarian, but they maximize returns for the unit. We have loads of other results, but the figures are kind of hard to puzzle through. So I'll just kind of summarize that co-wives treat each other the same, irrespective of age or order. Lots of people say, oh, the older wife is really nasty to the younger wives. We found no evidence of that at all. And the co-wives were also more egalitarian with one another than they were with their husbands, which, again, suggests that they're getting on pretty well with their co-wives. And so the kind of message I take from this is that polygyny is not necessarily using, at least among these two ethnic groups, is not necessarily dysfunctional nor conflict-ridden. And the kind of caricature that the economists portrayed, is not necessarily generalizable. Of course, this is just one case, but this is really nice data that Alessandra and Bethany collected. The next question is, are we committing ecological fallacies in our comparisons? And the ecological fallacies are where you make inferences about individuals mistakenly, because you're doing it on the basis of the group to which they belong rather than the individual. And that is it's a real danger to work when you're, you're using data across a very heterogeneous environment. Like this one. This is 56 villages in northern Tanzania of different, the colors mark different ethnicities, and you can see also it's a very heterogeneous ecology. And working with Savannahs Forever, this is a monitoring and evaluation organization that I work with, we had data, it was not collected for this purpose, but we had data, demographic data on 56 villages. This was part of actually a food security project that we were evaluating. And if you throw what we did first, this was work led by David Lawson, if you throw all the monogamous and polygynous women together into one analysis, yes, polygynous women are doing worse in terms of food security and child outcomes and things like that. But what we did was just take a multi-level hierarchical model and look at these things a little bit more carefully. And it's actually interesting, with all the ethnic groups together, the dotted line here is monogamy, right? So that's the base case. We're comparing monogamy. And against monogamy, you would really expect all these coefficients, whether for food security, for height for age, or weight for height, these are standard anthropometric outcomes for kids. You would expect all of these to be on the negative side, that these polygynous households are doing worse. And it's not true at all. There's not much patterning. I mean, if anything, polygynous households, specifically if the male is co-resident, are actually doing somewhat better in terms of food security, a little bit worse if they're female-headed. And when you look down across the different ethnic groups, you can see that at least in the Sakuma, the polygynous, certainly when they're male-headed, are actually doing better in terms of household food security and in terms of weight for height for kids, and a bit of the same pattern for the Rangi. So why is this? Well, it's kind of pretty obvious once you look at it. Here we rank all the villages according to the proportion of marriages that are polygynous. And then on the y-axis here, we have just one of our outcomes, but I can do this for any of them. Height for age, this is the village average score. And you can basically see that the villages that are most polygynous have the poorest outcomes, for example, here on height for age. And this is because these are villages up in Maasai land. They're far from infrastructure. They have very little health care. They don't have good sanitation or water sources. And so, to cut to the quick, it's not polygyny that's the problem, it's where these villages that are polygynous are. And this, I mean, of course, this is neither here nor there. This is just one study. But when I look at these global, or lots of people use DHSS data to study these kinds of questions, and they very rarely use multi-level models. And so I think this ecological fallacy is a real problem in many inferences that are drawn from these kinds of data. Okay, going on to the third side path, and then we'll go back to H3. Are we comparing monogamy and polygyny appropriately? And you may have been thinking, well, to call a woman monogamous or polygynous, that's kind of silly because she might change her marital status over her lifetime, and of course you're right. You may also be thinking that different kinds of women will go into polygynous marriages. So these are pictures of people, the Wapimbwe, I'm going to talk about in a minute. So this woman who's a traditional doctor, or these women who are brewing local beer, are probably more willing to go into polygynous marriages than this rather smart woman who's selling tea to road builders in the area. And you may also be thinking the effects of polygyny might depend on, for example, the age of a child. You know, a little kid like this might be protected because it's, you know, completely dependent on its mum, still breastfeeding. Whereas an older one like this, or particularly these guys, may be more exposed to the risks of polygyny. And, you know, you might sort of be worrying about, are we making these comparisons appropriately? And we decided to use, I have a data set of 20 years, and this is collected longitudinally, in a village in western Tanzania. This is over near the Congo border. And where women, obligingly for this study, love to marry and remarry and divorce. And I mean, every time I go back, it's different. And when the New York Times actually picked up on a paper I did, which they headed, "Skipping spouse to spouse isn't just a man's game." And this is really what the Pimbwe, this characterizes very well Pimbwe women. But so what we could do, well, Rihanna Monosha, who led this study, could do, we can think about the marital status of the mum. Let's do it from the kid's point of view. And so let's look at this kid here. His mum was in was in a monogamous marriage until he was 9. And then his dad took on another wife until he was about 17. And then his mum died. His mum died. This kid was born into a polygynous marriage, and then his mum had a co-wife. His mum then divorced and spent 4 years by herself. And when he was 6, his mum married a new man. So this kid, actually it's a girl, was living with a stepfather. And we can do this for 3,693 kids. And wonderful Bayesian statistics and all kinds of clever stuff goes on, which shows a very unremarkable result that polygyny has. So this is polygyny. This is where the mother is married to the biological father with a co-wife. Your mother, thinking from the child's point of view, your mum is married to your biological dad, but he has a co-wife. Absolutely no effect across up to the age of 20 on our outcome. Here is age-specific contrasts in survival, but we do the same thing for child growth, and we do the same thing for educational outcomes for the kids. And the pattern is pretty consistent across. No problems of your being in a polygynous marriage. No problems, hardly any problem of being with a stepfather, which is kind of surprising because there's so much evidence to suggest that's not true. The only thing that really is a problem for your survival is if your mum dies. And that goes through all the way through you up to the age of 20. And so what this really shows is, kind of, you might say sort of, well, it kind of, who cares really, this is just one population. That doesn't necessarily, we can't infer much from this, but the point that I draw from this study is it makes me want to question the robusticity of other studies. Because when you really look at data carefully like this, you're finding patterns which are very, very different from what we get with these gross coarse analyses. And I mean, you might be sort of thinking, well, what is going on here? And I think it's probably, you know, these women skipping from spouse to spouse. They are just ideal free distributing themselves. And I know this from every time I go back. If a woman's in a tricky situation, if the husband's not nice, or there's a nasty co-wife or something like that, next year she'll be gone. She'll be living somewhere else. And so I think that's why the only thing is you can't change, you know, if you're dead, then that's you're kind of stuck with that, right? I believe. So I've got through those three sidebars, and just to kind of take stock, where are we with H2, with the outcomes of polygyny and monogamy being equal? Basically, I think that we've shown that contrary to the sort of caricature of the UN and The Economist, the data, at least that I have, show that there are no clear costs associated with polygyny. We did that very coarsely with my original Poughkeepsie's data. We did a more sensitive analysis looking at the ecological fallacy or addressing the ecological fallacy with the Northern Tanzania Masai land data. And we did it really fine grain with the Pimbwe data. And we also looked at the absence of strong co-wife competition in the behavioral ecological games. And so, you know, why is this? And I think there's two things. I kind of hinted at them before. But one is the Western bias. Western bias just tend to assume that two women who are married to the same man are going to be hostile to each other, and they just kind of miss the bus about how, you know, reproductive cooperation occurs in at least many of the populations I've looked at. And the second is, as I've kind of made clear already, poor methodologies, poor analysis of causality, and also these problems of lack of resolution of data. When we really dug deep into those Pimbwe data, the pattern completely, the sort of negative effects of polygyny completely disappears. So that's where we are with 1 and 2. I think we have pretty good data supporting the polygyny threshold model. But when we get to hypothesis 3, we get into big trouble. So that is that we'll have more polygyny with greater resource inequality. And social scientists have known for a long time that the relationship between polygyny and social complexity is an inverted U-shaped curve. So you see this here. There's a really nice study, actually by Minosha, the same person, but in a different collaboration, where she analyzed this statistically, but I'm just going to show it you visually because it's easier. If you look at foraging and sort of small-scale cultivation societies, you get, you know, quite high levels of polygyny. Pastoralist societies, quite high levels. This is a mean percent female polygyny. But once you get to agricultural societies, particularly irrigation agricultural societies, you hardly get any polygyny. And this is the frequency of the norm. So this is the behavior and this is the norm. These are data taken from the standard cross-cultural sample, 186 societies. And again, you can see this inverted U-shaped curve. And this is despite the fact that agricultural societies are way more unequal. This is a Gini coefficient of wealth. Way more unequal than these other kinds of societies. It's actually taken from a different study, but that it is a well-recognized pattern. So we call this the polygyny paradox. It's completely contrary to the third hypothesis and what is going on. Why has polygyny disappeared in highly unequal societies? And working with incredible collaborators, Sam Bowles, an economist, Cody Ross, who's at the Max Planck, who was a grad student here and is at the Max Planck Institute now, and Xiangyun Oh, we decided to basically rebuild polygyny threshold as a mutual mate choice. So both males and females are making decisions to predict the conditions favoring monogamy, and then to explore these parameters empirically. And this is the last bit of data I'm going to present. Their model, I'll go through a little bit of it. The sort of key thing is that we differentiate what we call rival wealth. So that's, you kind of saw this in this figure earlier. You know, if I owe a cow, my co-wife doesn't own it. If Christina owns a strip of maize, it's not mine. You know, this is rival wealth. We can't both own it. And then we call that M to sort of capture material. And then there's non-rival wealth, we call G, and that's something that is shared amongst co-wives. So you could think of it as the guy's genes, you could think of it as his skill that maybe we all benefit from, or you could think of it as his reputation. These Kipsigis men gain great reputational boosts from having these huge beer drinking fests when everybody sticks a straw in and sucks it out. And you've got to be very careful not to blow. You get into big trouble. It's breaking cultural norms. And so we model male fitness as, male fitness here as a function of the number of his wives, and then his non-rival wealth, sort of his genes, you can think of it, and then his rival wealth, which of course is devalued by the number of wives he's got and the costs of acquiring them. And in this, the way that we build the model here, we have two weighting parameters, as you can see. We have this measure mu, which is the percent increase in a man's fitness that's associated with a 1% increase in a man's rival wealth per wife. So that is really, it's an elasticity measure that economists like to use, but really you can think about it as how important are cows and land to a man, to a woman's reproductive success, and therefore to the man's reproductive success as well. So it's really that curve that I drew in the first figure of the polygyny threshold. And then there's gamma, which is the same thing, which is how important is his non-rival wealth. But we're not going to talk more about gamma in this talk, basically because we don't have much data on it, so we can't pursue it. So far, really, this is absolutely the classic polygyny threshold model going back to Orions and Weatherhead, I can't remember, the people who introduced it back in the 70s and 80s. The only difference is that we have both male and female interests in that, so it's a mutual mate choice model. We have two other parameters are going to be important. One was really discovered more in the empirical analysis, but that's delta. And again, it's an elasticity. It's the percent increase in men's fitness associated with a 1% increase in number of wives, holding constant the man's rival wealth. So the way I like to think about this is when delta is 1, a guy's only good for his cows and land. He doesn't do anything else, right? That's him. Whereas when delta comes lower, it's like he's required to read one-on-one, because remember this is rival, one-on-one to each of his kids. Well, some of those guys, right, they had like 80 kids. That would be quite, and he's required to do it because otherwise they won't be able to prosper in life or whatever. It's a silly way of, it's obviously not what's going on in the real world, but it's a way I like to think about it to just introduce these ideas. So that's this measure of delta. And then there's this measure theta, which is the fraction of wealthy men, which is really, you can think about as sort of the extent to which there's a really wealthy elite, or the length of the right tail of a wealth distribution. So it's to do with the distribution of wealth, the patterning of the distribution of wealth. And when we run the model that I'm not going to do for you, I'm just going to tell you the results, we find that there are two conditions that favor monogamy, i.e. the demise of polygyny, even in highly unequal societies. That's the polygyny paradox, right? That's what we're trying to explain, why we can't support hypothesis 3. One is a low delta, this strong diminishing returns to adding wives. So the low delta is that you've got to read to each kid, one-on-one every night. And the second is a low theta, and that's our measure of basically an elite society with a very small class of very, very wealthy men. And the low theta is, you can sort of imagine it, if there are just very few guys in a society who have hundreds, thousands of cows, and everybody else has none, you think of that polygyny threshold model, every female's going to want to go and mate with them, right? And settle with them because they've got all the stuff. And under those conditions, this delta is really going to kick in. I mean, how can he read to thousands of children every night? So these two parameters are kind of interrelated. And the way that we, just to sort of help you through the logic here, I mean, just visually, I'm not going to go through the math or anything, but this is a classic Gini sort of Lorentz curve. So if you look at this black line, it's a totally equal society. 25% of the population have 25% of the wealth, 50% of the population have 50%, etc. So a straight line is equal. And this red line basically suggests that about what is it, about 6 or 7% of the population own 25% of the wealth. And so there's a small elite, a very wealthy elite, and otherwise people are relatively equal. And with this line, which they're both of them have the same Gini, that is measured really as the area under the curve, so they would be classified as being equally unequal, although actually not very unequal. In this population, what is it, like 25% of the population only have access to about 4 or 5% of the wealth. So it's got quite a large poor class, and then after that, everybody's pretty equal. And if you run the model through these populations, the model produces less polygyny under the X distribution than it does under the Y. The reason being, kind of as I said above, these guys just can't read to all those kids at night, right? It's too much work. So women, really won't want to mate with them. And if we make it a little bit more realistic and actually think about think about these populations I was talking about, foragers or horticultural small-scale cultivators or pastoralist populations, and then think about an agricultural population, you can see we're so allowing them to have different and more realistic Ginis. The agricultural population here has a very large class, a very small class, again about only 7% of the population own, 40% of the, 60% of the wealth or something. So we've got a sort of tiny elite. And this is a more egalitarian society with a lower Gini and more characteristic of foragers and pastoralists and small-scale cultivators. And if you run the model through this, you find, again, more polygyny under the X distribution, the blue distribution, than under the X, the red distribution. So these visually are just trying to capture the dynamics of the model. And so the last thing that we do, so the message to take here is it's not the extent of inequality, it's not the Gini that's affecting the outcoming mating system or marriage system, but it's structure that matters. It's how the wealth is distributed amongst these men. And so the last thing we did is look to see if there's a patterning of delta and theta in empirical data that's consistent with the explanation we're giving for the demise of polygyny in highly unequal societies where originally we would have expected it. We have this is sort of the work that I do in Santa Fe. We have this incredible collaboration of anthropologists, some economists, who have long-term study sites, who just know the people they work with very well, been collecting often longitudinal data. And so we this collaboration actually is for a slightly different project, but we sort of used many of them who had the right data to put together a data set where we had men's reproductive success, we had the extent of polygyny, and then we had locally relevant measures of of rival wealth, so things like livestock, land, money, household goods. Obviously, the measures differ between these people are working in really different kinds of societies across the world. And what we found is, again, coming back to this question, is there a patterning of delta and theta that is consistent with our explanation for the demise of polygyny? We find this, so here we're looking at delta, and delta is, surprisingly, not surprisingly, less than 1 for almost all the population. So obviously they're not reading books to their kids, but men are doing more than the rival wealth than is just measured. And so these measures, I should probably explain, were determined by running each of these populations, each of the 29 populations that we had individual level data through our mutual mate choice model to basically determine these parameters. So delta came out as pretty low for most populations, but the key thing is, look, it's much lower, generally much lower for agricultural populations than other ones, and that's where we get this polygyny paradox of, even though they're unequal, they're not marrying polygynously. So this was kind of consistent with our predictions. And then the second condition was that this extent to which you have a very wealthy, small, elite class, how is that patterned? And again, we have various ways of actually measuring theta, but just focus on one of them because they're all pretty much the same. That the theta comes out as much lower in the agricultural populations, at least 3 out of the 4. And that is, again, because they have this small class of very wealthy, typically landowners in these populations, or people in irrigation systems who have the best land. So again, that is sort of consistent with the explanation that we're giving. So I think, am I at 5 minutes or? It doesn't matter. I mean, I'm finished. It's fine. Yeah, I'm okay. Great. I'm there. I'm on my last slide, which is great. Nearly time to go home. The predictions, the first hypothesis that male territory equality correlates positively with number of mates and reproductive success. We supported that, and I showed a few other supporting studies, but that's been found across lots and lots of work. It's not really very surprising, so I'm not going further with that. The second, that is within population variation, right? This outcome, equal outcomes of fitness outcomes or fitness-related outcomes for monogamous and polygamously married females. That was consistent with the polygyny threshold model, and I think it's the material I've presented here suggests that we really need to, when we draw these kind of conclusions about outcomes for polygamously married women, we need to look at our data more carefully to make sure we're making accurate inferences. With respect to the third hypothesis, the data were absolutely contradictory. There's no polygyny in the most unequal societies in the world. And we identified and confirmed empirically 2 conditions that solve what we call the polygyny paradox. The first was having highly skewed inequality, this kind of elite class. And the second was the existence of rival qualities of males beyond material wealth that we were unable to measure, right? We could only estimate them. People didn't have data on that. And that's obviously an area we need to take this forward. But these 2 conditions were jointly sufficient to generate a transition to more frequent monogamy, even in highly stratified societies. So that was the polygyny paradox. And so from this, I just draw a few sort of final propositions. The first is that designating polygyny as a harmful cultural practice, I think, is wrong. I accept there are abuses associated with polygyny in some places, but to sort of characterize a whole mating system or a marriage system as being a bad thing is really culturally insensitive. There are many places that I've worked where really women want to be in a polygynous marriage. Maybe their best access to getting married to a wealthy male, which might be very important for them. There's an incredible study of from Central Africa, from the capital of Central African Republic, I've forgotten the name, Bangui, where women who have studied, who've done PhDs in Harvard and Stanford, go back to Bangui, and before they left, this is an ethnographer who worked there for a very long time. Before they left, they said, oh, I'm never going to marry polygamously, horrible thing, I'm going to go away and do a PhD, whatever. They come back super educated, and they end up marrying polygamously because they say it's actually much nicer. You're married to a wealthy guy, with a high status guy, you'll manage to get a house in Bangui. Apparently it's a very hard housing market. And he'll leave you alone because he's got other wives. So, and to tell those women that what you're doing is a harmful cultural practice would be extremely rude and culturally insensitive. So that's the first sort of proposition. The second is that the prevalence of polygyny over history and human prehistory is due both to competition among men, obviously, and the ability of women to make choices according to the ideal free distribution. And I don't think to always say polygyny is bad, that women can't make choices. They are making choices, and they appear in the studies that I've presented to be making choices that mitigate the costs and are beneficial for them. The demise of polygyny, we're arguing, is attributable to rational fitness individual calculations of men and women. Maybe I shouldn't have put fitness there, you could just say economic calculations. But men and women are basically behaving rationally in the decisions that they make. And we presented that model to show how that could even lead to a demise of polygyny when there's high inequality. And then finally, we can explain the emergence of monogamy as an adaptive response without further recourse to the role of norms or cultural group selection. This is where I have a beef with Pete, who's published differently on this. I think we maybe can reconcile our views now. But our argument is not that norms are important. We're really tackling the origin of this, and we're saying even without cultural group selection or without norms enforcing marriage patterns, which of course is very predominant across human populations, you can, on the basis of individual fitness calculations, find a solution that comes up with monogamy. And I think that's all I have to say, apart from I just obviously endlessly in gratitude to people all over Tanzania and Kenya, where I've just been so incredibly welcomed, come with my endless questions, and often they lead to great hilarity, but sometimes, of course, it's pretty tough, and collecting this data is hard for me, but hard for them sometimes as well. And to loads and loads of incredible collaborators, to generous funding organizations, and you, the listeners. Thank you very much.
Going to hand the microphone to whoever raises their hands. So we have plenty of time for questions. Really? This is, I don't believe it. There must be loads of questions.
They've heard too much from me. 2 days. Oh, Brenna.
Hi, Monique.
Hey.
So in the beginning, you discussed this article by The Economist, where they characterize polygyny as a harmful cultural practice. So my understanding from that very brief slide was that they classified it as harmful because it resulted in a lot of single unmarried men who then would have, for example, group conflict. And I guess I'm not seeing where, in which studies that you performed were single men actually measured, because of course they may not have had children, and therefore their children are not actually factored into this discussion. And then secondarily, I think the Economist is pointing out this group level conflict, which doesn't seem to be something that you've discussed in your polygyny model.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right about that. We've only taken one slice of it, and that is that it's bad for women. And I mean, actually these kind of popular rants on it are very unclear about the sort of causality logic. I caricatured it in just like, if you read those articles, that's what you assume they're thinking. They don't really say it very clearly. But at the root of it, they say that these households are unstable, they are not productive, and they're generating conflict, which then spills over into the whole society. And then, of course, right, it's exacerbated by all these unmarried men. But you're right, I have not tackled the whole of the issue. I actually think that there's loads of ways you can go with this. There is actually a paper under review at the moment, which actually is looking at the argument, using DHS data, looking at the argument that more polygynous societies have higher numbers of unmarried men in the specific age categories. They find no evidence for it at all. And it's because polygynous societies, the age gap between men and women is very different. And so these unmarried men are, they're excluded, but as they get older, they're going to, basically have women they can marry. So that's one, that's one thing. I was going to say something else about that study. No, I've forgotten. But the groups, yeah, right. The other thing, right, is this claim that there's more warfare in polygynous societies. I bet if we ran that through any kind of ecological fallacy analysis, if we put any controls into it at all, to think about what the actual mechanism is there, I'm absolutely sure it wouldn't. It just seems to me so, they pick on Islamic societies. There's a lot of instability in Islamic societies in many parts of the Middle East at the moment. and they kind of pin it down onto polygamy, and always springing from this, what's going on in the household's bad. And so I think we've kind of made a stab at it, but I completely agree with you. We have not completely tackled their arguments at all the levels, and it would be a big project, but it'd be a fun one to get involved in. Yeah, maybe I'll set David on it.
There we go. Yeah. I was super interested in your outcomes of the kid in relation to age and mother status. And from what I gathered, the data set you were talking about was relatively, the women had choice to move around or divorce or anything like that. And I was curious whether it is in a monogamous culture or in a polygynous culture, if there's any data to see how the metric of assuming non-free mating and mobility actually change things?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And we really, that paper just came out 2 weeks ago. We really, I think, are the first people to, you're talking about the Pimway study at the end where I had those kind of Bayesian things. Yeah. I think we really are the first people to do this, an analysis at that level of fine grain. And you're completely right. You may well, if there's absolutely no choice, if women don't have free ability to move around, to change their marital status, you may well find different outcomes. And that, I mean, just to follow on, the sort of logic of what you're saying, maybe in some of the areas of the world where these negative outcomes have been most stressed, which has tended to be in Islamic cultures in the Middle East, the argument has been that women can't change their marital status, but it's really not true. I mean, there's lots and lots of divorce in Islamic cultures. It's actually relatively easy for, I mean, it's supposed to be the man who takes the initiative on it, but I've seen even in Pemba, where the place I was talking about yesterday, women can easily precipitate a divorce if they want to. So yeah, but yeah, to do that analysis in a place where they can't change their marital status would be a really nice compliment. I mean, if anyone's got data to do that, please do it,
Yeah, that was super interesting. And I was also just really curious about in monogamous cultures that can't divorce, if there's any part of that literature that shows lower outcomes or anything.
Well, who would you be comparing the monogamous people to?
Good.
I mean, if it's a monogamous society and everybody's monogamous. But yeah, you could do
like before and after divorce laws or something like that became liberalized.
Oh yeah. Oh, I see. Right. To tackle the question of the freedom. Right. That's right. But to see if monogamous women are, I mean, they're the only people you can compare with is unmarried women. And there again, there's lots of evidence. Purported evidence that unmarried women suffer in terms of various child outcomes. But there's first the question of selection into, what kind of women end up in those situations. They may be poorer, have less economic security, less kin, whatever. And secondly, there may be, I don't know, I'm tired, sorry. There was another argument, but I've got it. Andy.
So going off the general idea that the mating systems have some flexibility that depend on various cost-benefit considerations, what's the status of evidence that over time, as conditions change in different places, like even in your early data set from the 1980s, it looked like population size got much bigger over time. And what would you even expect with changes in population size or changes in rainfall patterns or even climate change or just sort of anything that is a change that's large enough that you would expect a shift and other, good evidence of shifts?
It's a huge question. And it's often like the Kipsigis now are more monogamous. But it's probably put down to Christian groups who are coming in and excluding it. So there are all these kinds of other things going on. You'd like to say, initially say look at patterns of inequality, differences in wealth inequality, and test this model there. unfortunately, it's like what I was talking about yesterday, the real world keeps on impinging on, real things that happen that make it harder for these to test these models. So, but there are, so in the Pimbwe, for example, that we were seeing that because there isn't that much polygyny in the Pimbwe. I mean, I didn't tell you that because I was trying to keep the story simple, but there's not that much polygyny. In the old days, it was really just the chiefs who were polygynous. What my data, I mean, it's only 20 years or so collected longitudinally, but I do also have retrospective stuff because I do lifetime interviews on everybody. So, some goes back to sort of the 1950s, 1960s for the older people. And what we're finding is more polygyny nowadays than there was before. And this is because a road has come in now, there's new wealth, there's new marketing. And so, yes, if you're asking, is there flexibility in mating systems consistent with predictions from our model? Yes, but not many, I mean, maybe Leslie can correct me here, but I don't think many human behavioral ecologists have really exploited the longitudinal variation very much, have they? Maybe Karen Kramer, she looked at the effect of roads on, yeah, I don't know. But it's a good question, and it's one that I think we haven't examined as much as we could.
Hi, thank you.
Hey.
Just a quick question on trying to better understand how should we think about gender norms and women's seek for agency in this context. It seems that they have quite a bit of freedom from what you were saying in terms of making choices, even exiting the marriage if they are not satisfied. But how is the distribution of labor happening at the household? Who negotiates these roles in the household? And on one hand, I can understand the story of saying, the more women in the household, then perhaps this becomes a bit of a society that allows women to negotiate against a husband who's trying to enforce negative norms against them.
Yep.
But if the distribution of tasks or work in the household is uneven, you can think that sparks a potential for conflict in the household within women too.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I would, all of these populations are different, and so I don't want to kind of make too many generalizations, but in the this is not so true of the Pimbwe, but in the agro-pastoral population, so really that sort of Maasai study and also the Kipski study, there are very clear roles that men and women play, and polygynous women, it's also very clear what they do together and what they don't. So, things like which house the man eats in every night, which huts he sleeps in, is all very much kind of, there's rules. And so, in a sense, those are kind of norms that help, I really think help coordinate the conflicts that could arise. I think the reason and I'm going to say something now which sounds as if I'm contradicting what I said before, but there is quite a lot of conflict in Pimbwe households, and those polygynous marriages that I had, I mean, those kids that I drew up, I mean, that was just a random collection, but there weren't that many squares that were polygyny color. It's quite rare because when a man decides to marry polygynously, normally one of the wives will leave pretty quickly. And I think it's because, and I'm just speculating here, but they don't have the norms that the agro-pastoralists have, because in the past, polygyny was really the province of only of the chief, and the chiefs were very different. There was a different kind of caste almost. Everything was really different for them. So yes, you need to have norms to coordinate these things. And I mean, if you think in Islamic, where I didn't talk about Pemba, which is where I work now, which is very Islamic, there are very, very clear rules exactly over what polygynous women can and can't do, how much they inherit. And so, these help to coordinate activity and reduce conflict. That's not to say there's no, I don't want to, obviously, I mean, I should probably, fess up to, in the Kipski's case, there was a case of a co-wife poisoning putting poison into the water pot of another co-wife's house, and so one of the children nearly died of poison. It was like cattle dip poison. There was a case of arson. Obviously, like in real life, we all get into huge arguments with people sometimes, but I just don't think it's the... Yeah, I was going to say, Brenna, I was given, you came to where I was sitting in Wix, and you left a knife there. They gave me the knife, and I took it and I said, I'll take it. She said, shall I put it in the campus mail? I said, no, that's silly to put it. I said, I'm going to take it to the talk, and if Brenna asks a difficult question, I'm going to use it. And you asked the first question, and of course it was about absolutely the right question, and so I do have a knife in my bag. So women do... I really do. You can check it. It's on there. So women do squabble. Yeah, Pete, sorry.
This is an attempt to channel my senior author on that paper you challenged.
He does back off this a bit.
Joe
yes.
Henrik. So I'm pretending to be Joe Henrik as best I can here.
Yeah.
So Joe's argument has been that Christianity generated monogamy in the West as a way of controlling the power of sort of family corporations. And that, so that this is a major Western normative innovation, and that at least polygyny in our part of the world was limited, was prohibited basically by the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. And it's my understanding that in similarly high agrarian societies, for example, in China, there wasn't a norm against polygyny, and there was a certain amount of polygyny. So that would, and you'd mentioned that your data might be scrambled up in Africa by Christian missionaries coming in and forbidding polygyny. So so Joe's argument would be that it really is a cultural value-driven thing, that the U-shaped distribution that you showed. Now, does it have enough sample from, say, East Asian societies at the right time in history to contradict Joe's argument that it's so highly driven by Christianity?
Well, there are two bits to Joe's argument. Of course, I accept that norms and values in cultures can, so the sort of, the Christianity thing, I'm not sure I go along with it entirely. It's kind of Goody's argument, really, which he's adopted. And there's definitely some truth in it, but there's also plenty of evidence. Like if you think of William Scheidl's work, an economic historian or a family historian, polygyny disappeared in many cultures long before there's any evidence of codified rules. So, there is a polygyny paradox to, these are unequal societies. We know this from the archaeological evidence. They're unequal societies. It doesn't look like from the grave sites and from house stuff and, the way that archaeologists try to put together what family systems were like, it doesn't look like they were polygynous. So I don't question Joe's argument about what happened in Europe, that it was a kind of church dictate, and we have a pretty good history of that. But we know that monogamy replaced polygyny in other places without those kinds of forces. So that's one argument I have against it. And the second is, a part of Joe's argument that you didn't allude to, but he's really arguing, I believe he's arguing, I wasn't an author, so maybe I'm wrong, but there's a kind of cultural group selection to this, that these societies, as a result of their monogamous arrangements, and then dipping into all of this literature that I've been criticizing, were more efficient, more productive, less ridden with conflict, blah, 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 and they sort of replaced, or at least their norms were then adopted by other societies, or to some extent they replaced them. And I'm not, yes, there's some truth to that. As we see in Africa now, some of these churches are really pushing for for monogamy and stuff. So yes, there's evidence for that. But it also kind of worries me because if you look at the sort of ethnographic history of East Africa, you have these highly polygynous pastoralist groups who are highly predatory. I mean, like, look what the Kipsigis did to the Maasai. They kicked them out of areas, they took their women, and they married them. And so polygyny it's not altogether a losing strategy. As an economic, I think Burton and Dow did a big analysis of the traits that go along with polygynous societies, and definitely there was warfare, taking women as slaves and being expansionist. That was, I think, that 88 paper of Burton and Dow. So there's merit in what Joe and you guys have written, but I just don't think it's the whole story. And I still don't think it really tackles the origins question, which is what I'm always interested in. That's not to say norms are not important. Tim says cut it off. Tim's tired. And so
Tim,
he's probably quite right.
Stay here.
Or do you have a
One
question?
more? One more.
One more, sure.
Hi. I felt that the assumption of some of the models was that women could not hold resource outside of men. So how do the predictions change if women are able to have some independent wealth?
Yeah, that's a super important question. Thank you very much. It's a major, I mean, of course, if women hold some wealth, the model still holds. It's kind of, how important is that mu term, really? How important are the resources to women? So there may be kinds of wealth that women hold. And of course, even in the Kipsigis, women do, they've got stuff that's their own. It's just that cows and land is absolutely critical. And if you divorce a guy, you lose the cows and land. So, if you have a system where women are entirely autonomous, and I'm sort of beginning to think the Pimbwe are close to that last population I talked about, yes, everything changes. Then the assumptions of the model are not met. They're not dependent on males any longer, and they should be making choices more on, this is what Brennan, Brennan's been looking at, her students have been looking at make choice, and what criteria, maybe they'll be choosing on more physiological things like the compatibility of the HP, thank you, system. And those things might well kick in more when women can get access to their own resources. Why bother what the guy's got? Let's, choose a guy who's sexy or nice or whatever, or who's going to be a good partner for you. So yes, this is a very restricted model insofar as there has to be some sort of female dependence on male resources. And I mean, if you're interested in these dynamics in the non-human literature, animal behavior literature, people like Patty Gawati have really explored the variation in mating systems, taking that initial assumption, like birds have really different mating systems than mammals, because birds can fly, they can get away, actually sort of looking at these measures of autonomy. So yeah, that's an important thing to raise. Thank you.
All right, we'll comply and end there, but join me in thanking Monique for answering all our questions and solving all the puzzles.